Well, good evening, everyone. The time has come for us to begin. Lovely to see you all here. Sorry, I'm just getting my notes up here where I had who Ian is, but somehow I've tapped on my Medicare card, so I don't know what that's saying about Ian. It's my very joyous duty to welcome you to this our next in our sequence of Going Deeper evenings, and in particular because church history is a particular passion of mine. I do think we learn so much through the lives of people who are trying to do what we try to do, which is to live out our lives as disciples of Christ, to live out the impact of grace in our lives. And so that's why I'm particularly overjoyed to delighted to welcome you to tonight to be introduced by Dr Iain Maddock to these two amazing figures of church history, Selina, Countess of Huntingdon, and John Wesley. But I'll just begin by introducing Iain Maddock here. Dr Iain Maddock was actually in year 12 at Sydney Grammar School when I was a teacher. But since I was 22, so I think I was, we were very close in age. But since then, he actually went back to Sydney Grammar to teach after I'd left as well. And what did you teach, Ian?
Teaching geography, a bit of English, and copious amounts of sport.
And you met your wife there teaching at Sydney Grammar too?
Yes.
That's right.
But
yeah, that's right. And then you left Sydney Grammar and went to study theology at SMBC, which is where you now teach. But in between those years, you also served as an ordained pastor at the Trinity Baptist Church in New Haven, Connecticut, and studied at Gordon Conwell and also at the University of Aberdeen. So he's a well-travelled man and well-studied, certainly. And now returned to Sydney Missionary Bible College, where he is the head of Christian thought and oversees the teaching of theology, ethics, and church history at that great college. He's also published a bunch of books, and this is very important. He's brought some books along, and in particular, he's brought this book. This book is 10 Dead Guys You Should Know. It's a book he's edited, and I believe John Wesley appears in this book. But there is, you'll be glad to know, a companion volume in the works, which is called 10 Dead Gals You Should Know. So get volume 1, and then you can get volume 2 when it comes out. These are being sold tonight for the very low price of $15, and we do have our tap machine here. So in the break, perhaps you could come up. Michael will help us work out Michael Coyne will help us how to figure out the tap system. But $15, and this does what it says on the packet: 10 essays about 10 important men from church history that Ian's edited here. Only remains for me to invite him to speak to us, first of all, on John Wesley. Then we're going to have a short break. We'll have some questions, a short break, and then we'll return for the Countess of Huntingdon in the second part of our evening. Please welcome Dr Iain Maddock. Almost took your lecture off.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out this evening. It's great to see you all, and thanks for your warm welcome, Michael. So I'm going to start with John Wesley tonight, and you should have received an outline when you came in, so I'm going to be speaking to that outline. If you want to jot down notes as you go, any questions for the end. I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A, first of all on Wesley. So I've entitled this John Wesley, a brand plucked from the burning. It was late at night, and the Epworth rectory was burning. The fire that had begun only shortly beforehand was now rapidly threatening to engulf the entire house. The local minister, Samuel Wesley, had quickly managed to gather as many of his sizable household as he could, himself, his pregnant wife, Susanna, their maid, and all of their 8 children, at least so they hoped. And lead them to the safety of the garden. Now, once they were outside, they decided they best do a head count, only to discover aghast that one of the kids was missing. And you can guess who. It was none other than 5-year-old John Wesley. Now, with the house ablaze, all the family could do was kneel in prayer and commit young John's life to God. Now, meanwhile, John Wesley was still in bed asleep. His recollections of the night of Thursday, February 9, 1709, was that neither the heat nor the smoke was enough to wake him up, but instead the bright light of the encroaching inferno. He thought that dawn had arrived prematurely. When the maid failed to answer his call, John put his head out of the curtains and saw streaks of flame, of fire up on the roof. He had the presence of mind to climb on top of a chest near the window and poke his head out the window. He was spotted by neighbours, and a bunch of men formed a human ladder, and they helped him down, and just in the nick of time as well, before the roof of the house collapsed in. Well, after John's close shave, his mum would go on to famously describe him as a brand plucked from the burning, echoing the words of Zechariah chapter 3, verse 2. In the process, she instilled in her son's life an early sense of providential destiny, an awareness that his life has been saved, not simply from an untimely death, but for service in God's kingdom, achieving great things in God's service. Now, Wesley embraced this event as a defining moment and this verse as a virtual life motto. For instance, in this portrait, George Virtue's 1741 portrait of Wesley, it not only features a drawing of his dramatic rescue some 3 decades earlier. You can see the house here and the flames coming out the top. But it also has the inscription. It doesn't really come through. It's a little bit... there we go. Right down the bottom here is this verse from Zechariah chapter 3, verse 2. Is not this a brand plucked out of the fire? Now, Wesley would become one of the most recognisable Englishmen during the 18th century, a leader of what became known as the Evangelical Revival that transformed Great Britain's religious landscape. The revivals that broke out on the other side of the Atlantic became known as the Great Awakening, but part of the same overall movement. And yet his route from the relative obscurity of Lincolnshire to the undisputed figurehead of a movement that became known as Methodism was a circuitous one. Now, Wesley was born on the 28th of June, 1703, the 15th of approximately, the precise numbers are a wee bit hazy, 18 children born to Samuel and Susanna Wesley. Now, only 11 survived infancy, including John's younger brother, Charles. And we're all familiar with Charles Wesley, primarily through, I suspect, through his the many hymns that he wrote. The Wesley's home life was shaped by his father's affinity for high church Anglicanism and his mother's fondness for strict Puritan discipline. Break the will if you will not damn the child, was how she summarised her philosophy of child rearing, giving a little insight into the family culture. In time, Wesley would come to embody a fusion of his father's bookishness and his mother's focus on practical theology. In fact, some have described him, I think quite astutely, as a folk theologian at his core. Up until the age of 10, Wesley was homeschooled and discouraged from mixing with local Epworth children. All that was to change in 1714 when he was thrust out of these cloistered environs and arrived at the Charterhouse School as a boarder. University studies followed at Oxford, and he graduated in 1724. Now, what to do next? Well, a career in higher education was one possibility. Wesley was elected a Fellow of Lincoln College in 1726, much to his parents' delight. Another option was following in his dad's and older brother's footsteps and becoming a minister. Now, back then, strange as it may sound, would-be clergy didn't really need to feel any strong sense of vocational call. But Wesley sensed that this wasn't a decision to be taken lightly. And so throughout 1725, he writes a series of letters to his mum, Susanna, who not only encouraged him to seek ordination, but also helped him solidify what would become some of his most cherished theological commitments, especially, as we'll see, his lifelong allergic reaction to Calvinism and his lifelong focus on holiness and, in particular, Christian perfection as the zenith of that pursuit of holiness. So Wesley's commitments to these doctrines, they're really solidified in this series of letters that he writes during this year. It's fascinating. A relentless pursuit of holiness came to characterize Wesley's life during this period. He devoured the holiness writings of people like Thomas à Kempis and William Law, and this reading diet rubbed off. Outwardly, his quest for holiness expressed itself in terms of austerity and discipline and religious zeal. Inwardly, though, Wesley yearned for a deeper holiness. A poignant example of this unrelenting spiritual introspection was a diary he kept where he tried to measure the fervency of his holiness hour by hour. He tried to keep a virtual spiritual barometer of himself. Now, not only did Wesley pursue holiness for himself, but ever and always the mentor, and he ever and always was, he encouraged a whole bunch of eager acolytes to do the same. They became known pejoratively as the Holy Club. These were the original Methodists, and they included among their alumni the soon-to-be celebrity evangelist George Whitefield. We'll hear a little more about Whitefield tonight when we come to the Countess of Huntingdon. Now, Wesley might well have been thoroughly converted to holiness during his years at Oxford, but was this an evangelical conversion? Well, probably not. Looking back, Wesley gives the impression that at this point he hadn't understood grace, and he was effectively trying to earn his salvation, earn his way into heaven through his own works. He wrote, quote, "By my continued endeavour to keep his whole law, inward and outward, to the utmost of my power, I was persuaded that I should be accepted of God." His hope was that God would overlook his shortcomings and instead look approvingly on his religious sincerity. Well, Wesley's so-called Aldersgate Street experience, what we might call his second conversion, was a dramatic turning point in this respect. This was the point at which he came to realise that we need to be justified before we can be sanctified, and not the other way around. His brother Charles had just experienced the new birth a few days before, when on the 24th of May, 1738, Wesley went to a Moravian gathering at Aldersgate Street in London, where they were reading the preface to Luther's commentary on Romans. Now, Wesley's description of what happened next has become enshrined in evangelical folklore. Maybe you've heard snippets of this quote that I'm about to read. This is how Wesley remembers it. About 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for my salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. So what was kind of theoretical for him beforehand now became experiential and real for Wesley. And yet, as formative as these first and second conversions were in Wesley's life, it was another third conversion that set him on the path towards becoming the the John Wesley who is widely known today. Here we're referring to Wesley's conversion to itinerant field preaching as a key part of his effort to reach vast segments of socioeconomically and spiritually marginalised British society with the gospel. Even more, he'd go on to resource and oversee an army of fellow itinerant field preachers to aid in this endeavour. Now, Wesley was many things at once. He was an author, an editor, a translator, a hymnist, an amateur physician. His books, Primitive Physic, a bunch of sort of homespun remedies, still in print today. A teacher, an organiser, but above all else, if you'd ask him, John, what gets to the core of your identity? What is your vocation? He would have said without a shadow of a doubt that I'm a preacher, and an itinerant field preacher, to be precise. Now, many of the public portraits of Wesley memorialise this self-identity. For example, if we can just come to the second of the pics. This one's a portrait by Nathaniel Hone. In 1766. So this is Wesley as a relatively mature field preacher by now. Here it is. It's quite a famous portrait of Wesley, this one. So notice the way that it... Here we go. Notice the way it illustrates Wesley. So it illustrates him as... how is he wanting to come across? He's wanting to come across as a field preacher, an Anglican field preacher of one book. How does it convey that? Well, so he's preaching in a rustic setting. He's not preaching in a church. He's outdoors. So this is a big part of his identity. His right hand is raised. Notice he was not beyond giving like really granular advice to his lay preachers, and that included not gesticulating too much. In fact, he says, if you're going to raise your hands, make sure they don't go above shoulder height. So there he is sort of modelling, he's almost modelling that for everyone there. Notice the other hand is holding a Bible, and this Bible, it's no mere prop. How can you tell it's no mere prop? Because he's got his finger marking a page in the Bible. So he's showing this is a book that I'm using. Okay, it's not just here for show. I'm opening it up and preaching from it. So it's no mere prop in his sermons. And although Wesley's travelling lifestyle would slow down as his years advanced, he was still preaching 2 weeks before his death at the age of 87. Over the previous 5 decades, he travelled over 250,000 miles in all weather, often on horseback, preaching an estimated 40,000 sermons. Now, if Wesley's candid assessment was that his compatriot, George Whitefield, was prematurely aged by this field preaching caper, that he preached himself to death, if you will, then Wesley's own experience was that he preached to live. It was invigorating for him. Get these windows into this. As he got older, Wesley's habit was to describe the state of his health in his journal. And his journal, in terms of genre, this is much more Methodist propaganda than it is some sort of Dear Diary. But in his journal, he'd describe on his birthday the state of his health each year. And he would often attribute his good health not so much to his diet, but instead to the invigorating effects of a busy preaching schedule. For instance, on his 77th birthday, he wrote, quote, "I can hardly think I'm entering this day into the 78th year of my age. By the blessing of God, I am just the same as when I entered the 28th. This hath God wrought chiefly by my constant exercise, my rising early, and preaching morning and evening." So there you go. In fact, 2 years later, and he was still defying chronological gravity. Quote, "I find no more pain or bodily infirmities than at 5 and 20. This I still impute to my constant preaching, particularly in the morning." Now, given Wesley's temperament and upbringing, early on in his life, he described himself as a high churchman, the son of a high churchman. The fact that he even considered field preaching was huge. By contrast, when Whitefield began field preaching in February 1739 in England's West Country, he took to it like a duck to water. He was in his natural element. His dramatic oratory, when added to the sheer novelty value, made Whitefield an immediate sensation. And pretty soon, he found himself in really high demand. Now, Whitefield couldn't be everywhere at once, and so he enlisted Wesley's help, advertising that his former mentor would be preaching in his place in Bristol in early April, and then only letting Wesley know after the fact that this advertisement had been put out. Now, as far as Wesley was concerned, the whole matter was scandalous. Not simply the way he'd been conscripted into action, but even more the activity that he'd been conscripted into. After watching Whitefield preach outdoors, he reflected, quote, "I had been all my life till very lately so tenacious at every point relating to decency and order that I should have thought the saving of souls almost a sin if it had not been done in a church." And yet, Wesley caught Whitefield's vision. The Church of England's parish system hadn't kept up with rapid urbanisation, especially in coal mining regions in England's west and north. And so who was going to reach the unreached? Who was going to go to these people? And so Wesley became convinced that unless somebody went and preached to the largely illiterate and unchurched, and in a way that they could understand, in language that they could understand, there was little chance many of them would ever hear the gospel. He justified his unorthodox preaching by asking, when you boil it all down, what's the purpose of church structures like the Church of England? Quote, "Is it not to bring souls from the power of Satan unto God? Now I would fain know, where has order answered these ends? Not at any place where I've been. Not among the tinners in Cornwall, the keelmen at Newcastle, the colliers in Kingswood and Staffordshire, not among the drunkards, swearers, Sabbath breakers of Moorfields, or the harlots of Drury Lane." It's almost as though Wesley hears God speak to him, "It's too small a thing for you to be a light to Oxford." And so fusing apostolic Christianity with this spirit of enlightenment, bravado, he famously declares, "The whole world is now my parish." And on April 2, 1739, he goes on to preach his very own Sermon on the Mount. His description of this event isn't only full of pathos, but also a palpable sense of realised destiny. This was the reason that he had been spared from that house fire when he was 5 years old. This was the thing that God had prepared him for. And so he writes, "At 4 p.m, I submitted to be more vile and proclaimed in the highways the glad tidings of salvation, speaking from a little eminence in a ground adjoining to the city to about 3,000 people." Now these were drastic times, and Wesley felt that they called for drastic, unorthodox measures. And so rationalising his efforts to proactively take the gospel to coal miners and their families and not expect them to come to him, he reasoned, quote, "Had the minister of the parish preached like an angel, it had profited them nothing, for they heard him not." And so he's quite prepared to exploit the novelty value of field preaching if that's what it took. People's eternal destiny was at stake. And not just his listeners, but even his own, he felt. Wesley feared that if he didn't continue down the path that he had set out on, he would risk losing his own salvation. "But you know no call I have to play the part of an itinerant evangelist," he wrote to one critic. "But I do. I know God hath required this at my hands, that were I to refrain, I should never hear that word, 'Well done, good and faithful servant,' but instead, 'Cast ye the unprofitable servant into outer darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth.'" But if Wesley was a stubbornly convinced field preacher, there's also a sense in which he was a reluctant field preacher. Whereas, as I've mentioned, Whitefield was quite in his element. Wesley had to force himself to become a field preacher in spite of his temperament, inclinations. He made it very clear that if he had his way, he would much prefer to be back in Oxford, quote, a wanderer in the academic groves and a philosophical sluggard. That was where he would prefer to be. Libraries, not coal pits, were his natural habitat. Whereas Whitefield presented a relatively romanticised view of the itinerant lifestyle, Wesley's descriptions are much earthier. Field preaching was a cross for him to bear. Quote, what a marvel the devil doesn't love field preaching. Neither do I. I love a commodious room, a soft cushion, a handsome pulpit. But where is my zeal if I don't trample all these underfoot in order to save one more soul? To one of his many detractors, he wrote this, let me ask you one plain question. For what gain, setting conscience aside, will you be obliged to act thus, to live exactly as I do? For what price will you preach, and that with all your might, not in an easy, indolent, fashionable way, 18 or 19 times every week, and this throughout the year? For what shall I give you to travel 700 or 800 miles in all weathers every 2 or 3 months? For what salary will you abstain from all other diversions than the doing good and praising God? I am mistaken if you would not prefer strangling to such a life, even with thousands of gold and silver. And so Wesley became a keen student of the science of open-air preaching. He found natural amphitheatres to amplify his voice. He used walls and coal pits as sounding boards. Makeshift pulpits came in many forms. He once famously said he did more good preaching standing on top of his dad's tombstone in Epworth than he did preaching for 3 years from his pulpit. Wesley reinvented the way he spoke so that people without much or even any education could understand him. He cut out long sentences and big words as part of his effort to preach what he styled plain truth for plain people. One time, a friend from his Oxford days, Samuel Furley, came to him for advice about how he could follow in Wesley's ministry footsteps. Hear Wesley's homiletical advice. Quote, clearness in particular is necessary for you and me, because we are to instruct people of the lowest understanding. Therefore, we above all, if we think with the wise, yet we must speak with the vulgar. We should constantly use the most common, little, easy words which our language affords. And the thing was, Wesley had learnt this the hard way. Quote, when I'd been a member of the university about 10 years, I wrote and talked much as you do now, but when I talked to plain people in the castle or the town, they gaped and stared. This quickly obliged me to alter my style and adopt the language those I spoke to. For Wesley, evangelism and the responsibility that comes with privilege, they merged. Quote, and yet there's dignity in this simplicity, which is not disagreeable to those of the highest rank. You are a Christian minister, speaking and writing to save souls. Have this end always in your eye, and you will never designedly use a hard word. Use all the sense, learning, and fire you have, forgetting yourself and remembering only that these are the souls for whom Christ died. Sometimes we get the impression that because Wesley was an itinerant evangelist, he spent his time sort of travelling about helter-skelter, no rhyme or reason. And yet nothing was further from the truth. He was highly strategic, setting up a widespread network of preaching circuits, is how they were described, each serviced by a number of itinerant preachers. And yet, as important as preaching was for Wesley, it wasn't the sum total of his ministry, whereas Whitefield, by contrast, imagined his ministry more or less exclusively in terms of evangelism and nothing but evangelism. Wesley was committed both to evangelistic preaching and deliberate ongoing discipleship. It wasn't enough to simply sow God's word. It needed to be watered as well. And so the stereotype goes that wherever Whitefield went, he left an overwhelming impression of impassioned eloquence, but wherever Wesley went, he left a Methodist society. These societies were first set up in the 1740s, and they grew dramatically under Wesley's leadership. From small beginnings in Oxford, by the time of his death in 1791, it's estimated that there were over 70,000 members across the British Isles. In 1784, after the Bishop of London refused to ordain any Methodist preachers serving in the American colonies, Wesley took the unprecedented step of ordaining Thomas Coke to serve as the superintendent, a sort of de facto bishop of the newly formed Methodist Episcopal Church. So although Wesley's stated ambition was always to help reform the Church of England, never to create a rival denomination, that's ultimately what happened after his death in 1795. At first, though always in Wesley's heart, Methodism was a working class movement. He intentionally formed Methodist bases in cities like London and Newcastle and Bristol, growing urban centres with an even faster expanding economic underclass. Quote, "I bear the rich and love the poor, therefore I spend all my time with them," he once said. In a society that often equated poverty with moral impoverishment, Wesley offered a compassionate counter voice. One time, reflecting on the plight of the working poor, he said, quote, "So wickedly, so devilishly false is that common objection, they are poor because they're idle." The Methodists quickly became known for the way they cared for people's spiritual and physical welfare. Wesley set up a medical dispensary at his London base. He set up schools in London and Kingswood, and a poorhouse that gave housing for orphans and widows. He not only had a heart for the poor, he also had a heart for the oppressed. Wesley's very last letter was written to none other than the abolitionist William Wilberforce. He offered Wilberforce encouragement that was both realistic and prophetic. Quote, "Unless God has raised you up for this very thing, you will be worn out by the opposition of men and devils. But if God be for you, who can be against you? Are all of them together stronger than God? Oh, be not weary of well-doing. Go on in the name of God and in the power of his might, till even American slavery, the vilest that ever saw the sun, shall vanish away before it." That was the last letter that Wesley ever wrote. But as the Methodists grew in number, they also changed socially and demographically. Socioeconomically, they became much more upwardly mobile as time went on. So much so that as time went on, Wesley became alarmed that his people were increasingly losing touch with their roots. Towards the end of his life, he produced a flurry of sermons warning the Methodists of the seductions of wealth. Despite earning a significant income through his published writings, Wesley achieved his ambition to die with no wealth that anyone could inherit. He didn't simply preach, earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can. It seems he practiced it as well. Well, in this brief intro to Wesley, I've painted a relatively rosy picture of the man. And the reality is that, like all of us, Wesley was full of contradictions. Though he preached the possibility of Christian perfection, he was a work in progress. Wesley had an unfortunate habit of caricaturing Calvinism and slandering Calvinists. Whitefield always the exception to the rule. His marriage was a shambles, and it ended in separation. He only learnt of his wife's death after she'd been buried. He had a reputation for being autocratic and imperious. No one person succeeded Wesley as the leader of Methodism, and that was by his design. No one person could replace him. And yet, while Wesley was undoubtedly a driven and ambitious, very talented man, he was also profoundly humble, the sort of humility that accompanies a deep awareness that it's by grace alone that we're saved. He embraced the Apostle Paul's vision and was prepared to become all things to all people in order to win some, even if that meant letting go of prestige and status and comfort. God gave him eyes to see that there is a mission field right on his own doorstep, and that as disciples of Jesus, we can cross cultures without leaving our own postcode. As one of evangelicalism's founding fathers, John Wesley is an encouragement for us to go and do likewise. Okay, I'm going to pause and let you gather your thoughts, and then we've got a few minutes for questions.
Excuse me, and how strong do you think the Moravian influence was?
Oh, it was definitely influential early on when he met a bunch of Moravian missionaries on his way over to Savannah, Georgia. I didn't dwell too much on that in this talk, but on the way over from Great Britain over to Georgia, got caught in a dramatic storm. That they thought everyone thought they were going to die, and it was the Moravian confidence in the face of death that really struck Wesley. How can I have that sense of assurance that these people did? In time, he had points of disagreement with Moravians theologically that caused him to break ways with them. He was also a little put off by the cult of personality that seemed to surround Count von Zinzendorf, which is a little bit ironic given the cult of personality that surrounded Wesley. So possibly a little bit of projection going on there. But
give us the short story about who the Moravians.
Oh, so they pietists, German pietists, heavy influence on evangelicals in the 18th century, especially their devotional life. Yeah. Heavy emphasis on mission and the experience of faith as well. That would have a profound impact on Wesley.
Really humble.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, Ian, I've got a couple of questions. I remember reading some years ago a biography of Wesley and managed to mislay the book partway through. And I got as far as his time in America
Yes.
with his brother. And my recollection before I lost the book is that it wasn't altogether successful. They had a few problems. Is that right? That's my first question. Perhaps you could elucidate.
Correct. It was a bit of a saying they had a few problems is probably an understatement. Yeah. He fled under the cover of darkness with a defamation suit pending. It was never cleared up. So yeah, he made a lot of enemies in his time in Savannah. And by his own admission, he wasn't converted then. So he arrives back in England at a real loss in terms of where he's at in life. This is 1736.
Right.
Yeah.
My other question was, I couldn't help noticing Epworth. There's a very great hospital in Melbourne called Epworth in the suburb of Richmond.
Uh-huh.
Was that founded by Methodists? Is there a connection?
I don't know. It's possible. Sorry, can't help you with that one. Yeah.
Without trying to open a massive conversation, just give us the top level view on the Calvinist problem. What was his argument?
Like Wesley's objections? Yeah. That's a great question. Okay, so Wesley's really reluctant to define Methodism in doctrinal terms, but when he's pushed, he'll describe it as being like a house. So repentance is the porch, faith leading to justification is the door, but the inside of the house is holiness, sanctification. Okay? So as far as Wesley is concerned, any doctrinal system, theological system, that incentivizes holiness is great. Anything that disincentivizes holiness, he reacts really strongly against. So as far as he's concerned, unconditional election, for example, pretty basic Calvinist commitment there. As far as Wesley is concerned, that's a clear disincentivization to pursue holiness. If my salvation is a done deal from before the beginning of time, what point is there in doing anything? In preaching, in evangelism, in me responding, if it'll just happen. So obviously, that there would be clear Calvinist responses to all of those objections, but this, in Wesley's mind, these are his objections. Similarly, if you start saying when it comes to sin, even in our converted state, if we are holding, as Calvinists do, that indwelling sin is going to be our unwelcome, lifelong companion, what possible incentive is there then to pursue holiness in our lives? By contrast, if perfection, Christian perfection, not sinless perfection, he was careful to distinguish the two, but a Christian perfection, loving God, loving neighbour with all of our being, is not a possibility, that will disincentivise holiness. That's why perfection was such a big deal for him. And it influenced his definition of justification as well. So, whereas Calvinists typically defining justification in terms of all of our sins being forgiven, past, present, and future, and often including the idea of imputation, so us receiving Jesus' righteousness, Jesus receiving our unrighteousness. Wesley is very reluctant to use the language of imputation, lest we be let off the hook, either when it comes to our own unholiness or our pursuit of holiness. And he's also very careful to define the extent of justification as merely limiting past sin. Future sin isn't included in his doctrine of justification. Again, lest we start thinking that, okay, I've been justified, therefore all of my sin has been forgiven, therefore I don't need to pursue holiness anymore. So I think that sort of hermeneutic of holiness is a really important thing to grasp if you're coming from a Calvinist perspective at Wesley. If you appreciate that about him, then I think a lot of his misgivings about Calvinism suddenly become a lot clearer.
And I believe he took a lot of this from his readings of people like William Law.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. You know who else had a big influence was Richard Baxter.
And I believe also Hugo Grotius.
Yes, Grotius. Yes, yeah. So Wesley's interesting. He doesn't subscribe to a governmental view of the atonement. He's happier to. He comes across much more straightforwardly as a penal substitution guy, with all of the contradictions that that more naturally aligns itself with Calvinism, but he comes across that way. But yeah, Richard Baxter. So he inherits Baxter's approach to pastoral ministry in the Reformed pastor, but he also inherits Baxter's view of justification, which is what I've basically just laid out in Baxter's aphorisms, which came out a century before. So that was a very long-winded answer to your question.
Thanks for your talk. I started off with 3 questions. I used Dr. Google to answer my first. What does Methodism mean? And according to this, it says, what's the derivation? It says the methodical way in which they carried out the Christian faith, which is logical to me. My 2 questions.
Can I say a word on that? So it was originally a pejorative term. So, Methodists, you Methodists. And the Methodists embraced it.
Okay.
Methodists.
My second question then. I'll keep the third one. What's the relationship with the Methodist community today, or its various iterations, and other mainstream Christian beliefs? And the second is, given Wesley's emphasis on self-discipline, and it's a personal question, what was the cause of his unsuccessful marriage?
Can I start with the second one? I mean, that's a tricky one. I think so. He was very single-minded in his ministry. and functionally that had the result of being very single, even though he was married. I think that the reality was that the peripatetic lifestyle that he had taken on was not conducive to a stable home life. That's probably putting it simply. But there were some other social dynamics going on. His relationship with women was fraught. I think maybe a little naive. I think what he thought was helpful spiritual counsel was often interpreted by his wife for other women, was often interpreted as stepping over boundaries. So she was quite jealous of his interactions with women, rightly or wrongly. So I think it does certainly give us pause when it comes to sort of praying that God would send us another Wesley, or even that God would send us another Whitfield. That itinerant lifestyle was certainly not conducive to a stable home life. I recommend a book to you. It's called Good Christians, Good Husbands, ? Where it looks at the marriages of Wesley, Whitfield and Jonathan Edwards. So he was another revivalist of this period who led a much more sedentary life. And his marriage was a lot better than either Whitfield's or Wesley's. Methodism as a denomination, it continues. It's under the guise, in some respect, of the Uniting Church here, but there's a discrete Methodist church, certainly in the UK, and in the US as well. And it generally has a more Wesleyan Arminian flavour than a Calvinist flavour, though there are some exceptions to that rule in Wales, interestingly, where Welsh Calvinistic Methodism still persists today.
John did the preaching, and Charles, did he ever use music as an aid to his evangelism?
Oh, interesting.
His brother?
Yes. Yeah. So one of John's most famous sermons, or infamous, depending on how you view it, it's called Free Grace. It's a really forceful attack on unconditional election. Published it first, printed it, spoke it, then published it in 1739. Went through a whole bunch of editions. Very early on, that sermon came with a Charles Wesley hymn attached. So it was like a 1-2 punch. You read the doctrine, sing the doctrine. So either way, you're getting it. Yeah. They were a dynamic duo, those two. Yeah.
This is more of an observation than a question. I'm wondering whether or not someone who is as itinerant as this man was, 250,000 miles on the back of a horse is, by my calculation, 10 times around the equator, approximately. I'm wondering how that kind of mentality squares with the rigorous discipline of what Methodism was all about. It seems to me that it's pretty hard to maintain those opposites in a coherent fashion.
The opposites of ceaseless travelling.
Yes, excessive ceaseless traveling.
Mm.
And yet, the rigors of what Methodism was all about was very structured,
Yeah.
scriptural study, prayer,
Yeah.
daily rigors. It seems to me that that is much more conducive if you are much more of a fixed person, a professorial type, so to speak,
Yeah.
as opposed to an itinerant. It must be very, very difficult
Yeah.
emotionally and intellectually to try to reconcile those two extremes.
Yeah. And so that, I think, comes to Wesley's, a John anybody else couldn't do what he was doing. He had uniquely been raised up for this task. So most Methodists were sedentary. He wasn't encouraging everybody to live this lifestyle. Even like his circuit riders were, relatively, contained in the geographic area that they were travelling. But those rules didn't apply to John. He was the supremo of this movement, and so that it required him to be everywhere and anywhere at all times, right to the very end.
At that point, we might break for 5 minutes, just 5, and if people would like to purchase the book, is it a matter of just coming up and tapping the machine?
I'll stand by the machine.
Tim will operate the machine. You've got 5 minutes, and then just stretch your legs, and then we'll back to the council. I think we've got to talk about Wesley as well. You just want to have a look?
No, I just buy books anyway.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. A good shopping trip for me is if I go to Coro and I there's one book that I didn't have on my list.
Oh. vocabulary. If you would sit down, please, ladies and gentlemen. We're almost. Mr. Hetherington, I'm looking at you. And we'll continue. I think we'd better just continue.
For about 8 years. We're back there quite a bit. So my wife's American born. Well done.
Okay, we're going to begin.
All right, folks, part two, and we're staying in the 18th century, and we're also staying in Great Britain, but we're going to focus now on Selina, the Countess of Huntingdon, the Queen of the Methodists, as she's been sometimes styled. I thank your ladyship for the information concerning the Methodist preachers, replied the Duchess of Buckingham in a letter to a fellow noblewoman. Thanks, but no thanks, as it turned out. The Methodists, she went on, were strongly tinctured with impertinence and disrespect towards their superiors, perpetually endeavouring to level all ranks. Worst of all, the Duchess was particularly affronted by the uncomfortable implications of the doctrine of original sin upon her own sense of innate superiority. Quote, "It's monstrous to be told that you have a heart as sinful as the common wretches that crawl on the earth. This is highly offensive and insulting, and I cannot but wonder that your ladyship should relish any sentiments so much at variance with high rank and good breeding." Well, the certain ladyship on the receiving end of this candid correspondence was the then 34-year-old Selina Hastings, Countess of Huntingdon. Recently converted, Selina was keenly aware that her privileged status within British high society came with rich gospel opportunities. In practice, this meant inviting her peers, in many cases, fellow peers, to join her in listening to famed evangelists like George Whitefield, whom she'd later enlist as her personal chaplain, preach the gospel. For all of her misgivings, the Duchess of Buckingham went on, quote, "Your ladyship does me infinite honour by your obliging inquiries after my health. I'm most happy to accept your kind offer of accompanying me to hear your favourite preacher," that favourite preacher being Whitefield. Selina was a winsome and persuasive ambassador for the gospel in rarefied aristocratic circles. Before long, she was renowned for making the most of every opportunity on a national scale. Described by one of her contemporaries as the Queen of the Methodists, her unique contribution lay in investing her considerable resources as a patron of the burgeoning evangelical movement. Her entrepreneurial energy was exceptional, establishing and overseeing a network of Calvinistic Methodists, her so-called connexion, building chapels and populating them with a cadre of preachers, and even establishing a seminary to train future generations of evangelists. A tornado and a silver spoon wrapped into one, a 5'6" force of nature and the heiress of old money, as one person has described her. The Countess of Huntingdon stood alongside the Wesley brothers and Whitefield as one of the most visible leaders of the 18th century evangelical revival. Selina Hastings was born on the 24th of August, 1707, at Astwell Manor in Northamptonshire. Although her upbringing was materially privileged, it was also filled with relational dysfunction. Her aristocratic mother and father separated when she was only 6. Her mum relocated to France with Selina's baby sister, while she and her older sister were raised by their dad in England. When she was 17, Selina moved to Staunton Harold Hall in Leicestershire, a property she inherited after her father's death. And it was there that she met and in 1728 married Theophilus Hastings, the 9th Earl of Huntingdon, who lived nearby. By early 1732, the couple already had 4 children. 3 more would follow in the ensuing years. Pregnancy took a heavy toll on Selina's health, and as was the custom, on doctor's orders, she was sent to Bath to take the waters as a way of recuperating. Now, from all accounts, the whole experience was medicinally underwhelming and socially nauseating. The most stupid place I ever yet saw, she wrote. Her expeditions to the ancient Roman spa city would nonetheless leave a lasting impression on Selina, and it gave her a real heart to reach what she styled the fine ladies of Bath with the gospel in the coming years. During the first decade of her marriage, the Countess of Huntingdon was religious and philanthropic. Congregation. From this point onwards, for all of her affection for the Wesley brothers, her theological die was cast in a Whitfieldian mould. Quote, her religious principles were strictly Calvinistic, reflected one contemporary, and the doctrines of grace were the marrow thoroughly unhappy, she continued. Well, Theophilus' prophetic dream ended up coming true. Selina wouldn't write or hear from her husband again. Just 2 weeks after this strange dream that he had, he died of a stroke on the 13th of October 1746 at their Downing Street residence in London. The Countess of Huntingdon found herself widowed at the age of 39 and at something of a crossroads in life. Overwhelmed by grief, for the next 4 months she was a virtual recluse and even contemplated withdrawing from society permanently. In early 1747, she consulted Howell Harris about which was best, to live retired and give up all or fill her place. And in what would prove to be a pivotal conversation, Harris convinced her to live an active public life. From this point onwards, her mind was set. Quote, "I dread slack hands in the vineyard. We must all be up and doing." Now, in many ways, Whitefield and not Selina was the obvious candidate for the role of supremo of the Calvinistic Methodists. Arguably one of the most famous personalities of the 18th century, he was the first evangelical celebrity preacher and the public face of the revivals that were sweeping the transatlantic world. But first and foremost, as I've already mentioned, Whitefield was an itinerant evangelist at heart, not an administrator. He had an allergic reaction to anything that threatened to restrict his mobility. He had no interest whatsoever in being tied down by the responsibility of overseeing societies. In his own mind, sowing the seed of God's word was his calling. The task of watering it, that was for others to take care of. "Everyone hath his proper gift," he once said. "Field preaching is my plan. In this I'm carried as on eagle's wings." Well, in 1748, Whitefield returned to England after a 4-year stint in America, and he was welcomed back ashore by Howell Harris, a Welsh itinerant, who immediately whisked him away to meet with Selina at her London home in Chelsea. As a peeress, Selina was entitled to appoint a number of personal chaplains, and she had Whitefield, the Prince of Pulpit Orators, as he was known, in her sights as just the larger-than-life personality to reach her contemporaries. Over the summer, she hosted a series of events to road test Whitefield's preaching before audiences, including, amongst others, Lord Bolingbroke and the former Chief Secretary of State, the Earl of Chesterfield. These guys embodied Selina's target audience. They were rich, they were famous, and they were unconverted. The grand itinerant's preaching was a hit. Bolingbroke's verdict was that, quote, "Whitefield is the most extraordinary man of our times. He has the most commanding eloquence I've ever heard in any person." Chesterfield was no less enthusiastic. "Mr. Whitefield's eloquence is unrivaled, his zeal inexhaustible, and not to admire both would argue a total absence of taste." Selina was delighted. If anything, her expectations were exceeded. She reported to a congregational minister, Philip Doddridge, "I must tell you that I have had 2 large assemblies at my house of the mighty, the noble, the wise, and the rich, to hear the gospel by Mr. Whitefield, and I have great pleasure in telling you that they all expressed a great deal in hearing of him. Sometimes I do hope for Lord Chesterfield." Whitefield was no less optimistic after these gatherings. Quote, "I went home never more surprised at any incident in my life. The prospect of doing good to the rich that attend her ladyship's house is very encouraging. Who knows what God may do?" To a fellow Methodist preacher, he wrote, "The prospect of catching some of the rich in the gospel net is very promising." Even deists like Benjamin Franklin, who had an intimate working relationship with Whitefield as the main publisher of Whitefield's journals and sermons over in the American colonies, he recognised the tremendous potential societal good that might transpire from the religious awakening of the upper classes. He wrote, "If you can gain them to a good and exemplary life, wonderful changes will follow in the manner of the lower ranks." Whitefield and Selina were a perfect ministry match. Soon afterwards, the Countess offered, and Whitefield accepted, her scarf as her personal chaplain, always sure to adopt a posture of deference and humility towards his patroness. Whitefield's unexpected upward social mobility left him giddy with excitement. This son of a publican and a lowly servitor at Oxford University, and by servitor I mean that while he was an undergraduate student, he used to perform menial tasks as the servant of rich students in lieu of the hefty tuition costs that were out of his family's reach, financial reach. Whitefield had gone from that, a servitor, to what he would, how he would always describe himself from this point onwards as chaplain to the Right Honourable Countess of Huntingdon. Well, if Whitefield knew himself well enough to realise that presiding over the Calvinistic Methodist societies was not his forte, then the newly appointed chaplain also knew just the person for the job. And, of course, here referring to Selina herself. Quote, "Perhaps the Lord is fitting your ladyship for some new work," he wrote in May 1749. 6 months later, he was more direct. "A leader is wanting. This honour hath been put upon your ladyship by the great head of the church." The Countess of Huntingdon assumed the organisational role that Whitefield had declined. Her evangelical entrepreneurialism was a critical factor in bringing an evangelical witness to the English aristocracy. Just as Wesley established and oversaw a multitude of Methodist societies, fashioned in his own Arminian theological image and serviced by an array of itinerant evangelical preachers, likewise Selina would establish and oversee societies of her own. Collectively known as Lady Huntingdon's Connexion, these were similarly fashioned in her own Calvinistic theological image. If Selina was the Empress of her new connexion, suggests one biographer, then Whitefield was her prime minister. Whitefield's preferred description, that she was more like a good archbishop with her chaplains around him, perhaps better captures her desire to remain a loyal member of the established church and avoid creating a rival denomination, though this is eventually what transpired in her twilight years. Beginning in 1750 and extending over the next 4 decades, Lady Huntingdon's preachers proclaimed the gospel at a constellation of chapels throughout Wales and England. These chapels eventually grew to 64 in number and provided places of worship where evangelical men could preach without the strictures often imposed upon them by the hierarchy of the church. Now, her initial practice was to lease properties with chapels attached, but in time this made way for building chapels from the ground up. Proximity to water-based leisure and recuperation was a recurring feature of the chosen locations for these chapels, whether it be up-and-coming seaside resort towns like Brighton or fashionable spa towns like Bath and Tunbridge Wells. In Georgian Bath, a place where Selina had a long history and longed to see transformed by the gospel, she chose to employ her favourite style of architecture, the Gothic. Opened in 1765 with much fanfare, the Bath Chapel was created with her target audience's tastes in view. With its crenellated frontage, tall arched windows and intersecting tracery, the chapel was designed as a building in which the aristocratic residents of Bath would feel at ease. It also had a unique feature, a seat located immediately inside the front door, curtained off from the rest of the sanctuary, where high-ranking Church of England clergy could come and listen to Selina's preachers incognito. Much of the stigma that was initially associated with the Methodist wore off as time went on, but one suspects that the prospect of a bishop undergoing the dreadful disgrace of being seen in such a place meant that Nicodemus Corner, as it became known, was often occupied from all accounts. The Countess of Huntingdon was careful to schedule public gatherings at times that didn't conflict with Church of England worship services. But in retrospect, conflict and eventually separation from the established church was inevitable. In 1779, just a couple of weeks after she opened her latest chapel at Spa Fields in London, Thomas Hawace, an ordained Church of England clergyman, appointed as another one of Selina's personal chaplains. He had his right to preach challenged in court by the curate of the local parish. Quote, the prosecution case was simple and, as it turned out, persuasive. A chapel with seating for thousands, a public entrance and tickets sold for seating could not in any reasonable manner be construed a private chapel. And so the tenuous legal foundation upon which Selina had simultaneously attempted to build her connection and remain a loyal member of the Church of England, it crumbled. The court not only decided against the Countess, but also established a precedent for future ecclesiastical litigation. Faced with the decision to either close her chapels or else register them under the Toleration Act, so become nonconformists, in 1782, she reluctantly chose the latter. I am to be cast out of the church for what I have been doing these 40 years, speaking and living for Jesus Christ, she lamented with a dose of defiance. While some of her preachers followed her into dissent, most, like Hawace, the preacher who had that court case initially brought against him, he stayed within the Church of England. And I think in the process contributed in large part to the Calvinistic Methodists' failure to flourish to the same degree as Wesley's Arminian Methodist wing. At their high water mark, though, and the Countess of Huntingdon's chapels multiplied at such a rate that the demand for preachers began to outpace supply. This immediate shortage, coupled in 1768 with Oxford University's decision to expel 6 students for, quote, holding Methodistical tenets, provided Selina with the impetus to challenge Oxford and Cambridge's monopoly on training ministers and establish a seminary of her own design. Trevecca College was the fruit of this vision. Originally a rundown farmhouse near Howell Harris home in Wales, the Countess single-handedly funded every facet of the college's operations, from its initial renovation to faculty and staff wages, to providing full bursaries for all of the students. She hoped, perhaps naively, that the Church of England would look kindly on Trevecca's graduates when it came to ordination. The reality was that only a handful succeeded in this endeavour, and the students from the college were often treated with a fair bit of suspicion. Trevecca opened on the Countess's 61st birthday, the 24th of August, 1768. It was, in effect, a gift from herself to the wider church. Whitfield presided over the opening ceremonies, and in an act of evangelical ecumenism, an Arminian, John Fletcher, was chosen as the first principal, very magnanimous. By this stage, the Countess of Huntingdon had only 2 surviving children of her own, and she was estranged from one of them. In many ways, Trevecca's students would become her spiritual offspring. They certainly saw her in a maternal, if somewhat matriarchal, light. She regarded her young men as her sons, as her family, declared one Trevecca alumni in a sermon preached in Selina's honour soon after her death in 1791, same year that Wesley died. With what affection and tenderness, wisdom and prudence have I heard her address the young men in the study around her. How has she warned, cautioned, reproved, comforted and encouraged us as she saw cause, like a true mother in Israel. Well, if the generosity of wealthy female patrons like Phoebe was integral to the flourishing of the gospel in the 1st century, then the generosity of wealthy patrons like the Countess of Huntingdon was no less integral to the flourishing of the gospel in the 18th century. Quote, when I gave myself up to the Lord, said Selina, I likewise devoted to him all my fortune. The generation of preachers she helped raise up attested to her willingness to lay down at the foot of the cross her honours, titles, distinction and fortune. We're used to aristocrats forming their own regiments or cricket teams, wrote one biographer. But an aristocrat who started her own church is a class apart. Indeed, she was. If Wesley and Whitefield are celebrated as founding fathers of contemporary evangelicalism, then Selina was no less the movement's founding mother. The evangelical revival of the 18th century might never have gained the acceptance that it did, apart from the endeavours of the Countess of Huntingdon, observed one biographer. The Countess used her unquestionable influence in the higher circles of the land and even in the royal court to throw the cloak of her protection over the prominent preachers of the day and over the fledgling Methodist movement itself. In fact, the verdict from the royal court was nothing short of glowing. Quote, "There is something so noble, so commanding, and withal so engaging about Selina that I am quite captivated with her ladyship," commented none other than King George III. "I wish there was a Lady Huntingdon in every diocese in my kingdom." And that's where I'll leave it there.
Some questions?
Was her husband, the Earl, related to Warren Hastings, who became Warren Hastings, who became Governor General of India and famously impeached by Edmund Burke?
That sounds like a question for Dr. Google. I am not sure if there's any relation. Possibly. Possibly.
Because I know Warren did come from the minor gentry, but possibly there might have been a discount line, I'm wondering.
Thinking a bit. You mentioned the term Arminian at least 5 times.
Yes.
Now, I've worked out it comes from the Dutch, but I have no idea what it actually means.
So John Wesley would be an example of an Arminian. The term named after a Dutch theologian, James Arminius. Sibling rivalry with Calvinists within the evangelical stream, but a different way of understanding the divine-human relationship in salvation. Okay, so election is conditional; it's not unconditional. I guess that's one of the major differences that we've begun to see. There is, without rehearsing some of the discussions that we had in the first half. So that the Methodist societies were sort of split along Calvinistic and Arminian lines. On those differences regarding the divine-human relationship in salvation. Well, and so there's the challenge. I mean, on some level, this is like the differences appeared as a chasm. From another perspective, it was a mere sort of crack in the sidewalk that needed to be negotiated. And the way sort of Wesley, Whitefield, Selina navigated that tension, sometimes it appeared more like a chasm, sometimes it appeared more like a crack in the sidewalk that they could easily traverse.
Once again, a curious observation of that portrait. Is she pointing at her pen and brain? Is she resting? I also notice it's her left hand, which, if you take the premise that the left side of the body controls the right side of the brain, does that mean that only left-handed people are in the right mind?
So I have very little to offer in terms of textual criticism of Selina's painting compared to the Wesley portraits that I showed before. But maybe she is signifying something by the pose that she's adopting there. I don't know.
It's also that they, more prosaically, they would have had to sit still for a long time, and resting your head on your hand is an easy thing to do.
Propping yourself up, maybe. Yeah.
I'm just curious that they both passed away 3 years after settlement here in
Yes.
So all this happened such a long time ago, but I suppose the question is, what did it lead to in terms of what came over to Australia as a denomination?
Well, I mean, the Methodists were quite active here from a fairly early stage. Yeah, quite a rich legacy of Methodist involvement here in Australia. Again, more with a Wesleyan flavour than a Calvinistic flavour. Yeah.
Was it Salvation?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Whole Salvation Army, apart from anything else.
Yes.
So I was going to ask you, I was about to ask about Australia too, but also just in terms of the way in which the evangelical movement seemed to be able to work across these differences. Just reflecting on that in the context of today's evangelical movement, is there a lesson to be learnt, or could you reflect on how evangelicals do go about it? I mean, have we been good at this, or are we sort of more in chasm land?
Oh, I feel like these guys, they embody both the very best and worst of evangelical tendencies. So on one level, the rich vistas for sort of trans-denominational cooperation, and that spirit of sort of healthy entrepreneurialism. I think there's much to be learnt for better for us. Conversely, maybe that trans-denominationalism and treating denominations merely through their utility, I think this may be a less than helpful thing as evangelicals that we've inherited. So denominations simply a good boat to fish from. Losing their ecclesiological integrity in the process. Like these guys were much more trans-denominational evangelicals, and Anglicans a very distant second or third. On the one hand, I think they offer a great example for the way evangelicals can cooperate. But maybe another thing I'll mention is just the rise of the celebrity preacher during this era. So I think, in a sense, Whitfield was kind of your prototypical evangelical tele-evangelist without the telly bit. And not to suggest that there were any sort of any scandals there, but I feel like that propensity to be wowed by celebrity preachers has been hardwired into our DNA from these founding fathers, for better or for worse.
I have to say, Billy Graham kept coming in my thought because he travelled the world and then left behind for others to nurture.
Yes. Yeah.
Similar.
Yeah.
Happening, wasn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So it's that emergence of parachurch style ministries that's so, but we take for granted as evangelicals. I think again we sort of see the seeds of that being sown in this era. I feel like if you don't understand this era, you won't understand contemporary evangelicalism.
Is the word evangelicalism still worth using? A lot of people wouldn't be proud to own it as a name.
Yeah.
In the last 10 years even.
Yeah. I mean, certainly in the US it carries a much more sociological flavour, and maybe that's the case increasingly here as well. I think the word still has integrity, but it requires definition.
Can I just ask, thank you very much for all that, Ian. Just a thought brought on by particular content and arrangement of your talks tonight. Just wondered, in this situation for Wesley, where Whitfield really was, quite a big, feature going beside him and having the Calvinistic approach, I'm just wondering whether, since he would have been open to being aware of that, would there be any possibility in your mind that his staying About the doing?
Yeah, so
It's not exactly the same, but it's just...
no, it's closer.
What you're saying.
So that the flavour of high church Anglicanism that Wesley was raised with, yeah, it definitely had an Arminian flavour to it.
I just never thought about it before until you were speaking.
That was the... so some biographers have said, look, humanly speaking, Wesley could not have been anything other than an Arminian, given the sort of Anglicanism that he was raised with, and his father's influence, his mum's influence. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And also the almost non-Jewing sort of background as well.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Well, very good. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
I've really enjoyed tonight, and I've learned a great deal. At Moore College, I was saying to Ian beforehand, we tended to major on the 16th century, and we only really did sort of cursory travels in the 18th century. So I feel very underdone, and so it was terrific to hear about John Wesley and about the Countess of Huntingdon, and an extraordinary movement which has impacts even today. I mean, is the Countess of Huntingdon's connection still going?
I mean, there are still physical trace elements of
Right.
it, but yeah, it's yeah.
But perhaps Wesley's impact is still perhaps
Yeah.
more life in the world.
Yeah.
But we really wanted to hear about these people because they're both sort of so impacted by the grace of God in different ways to make such a practical difference and have such an extraordinary influence. So thank you very much for introducing us to both of those and for coming out this evening. And we might thank Ian again. And you can thank him even more by purchasing a copy of his book, which he very kindly offered to sign. Which is I haven't. He didn't, but I just offered it. So 10 Dead Guys You Should Know, and we are passing a gift on your behalf to Ian for his efforts tonight. Before you go, Tim just wanted to talk about.
Well, as a fitting sequel, I believe Ian, your colleague Dr. Rachel Ciano, will be speaking to us about Catherine Booth. Who is one of the features in your upcoming book with Rachel, is that right?
Correct.
Could you say something quickly about her, maybe?
Yeah, so we couldn't really do 10 dead guys without doing 10 dead gals. So that's coming out, Lord willing, by the end of next year.
Okay. Well, at our St Mark's conference on the 22nd of October, we'll be hearing Rachel. She'll be coming and speaking to us about Catherine Booth. We'll also, on that day, be hearing from Michael, who'll be speaking about the power of grace over the course of a couple of plenary talks. One on grace in our lives and relationships, and God's grace to transform our communities and our city. We'll also be having a kids program, some time together, some time having a meal together. The day will run from about 9 until 3 in the afternoon. It's a Saturday, so stay tuned for that. I think it'll be like about $25. We'll basically cover lunch. It should be a great time together as a community and to continue picking up this thread and thinking about seeing how grace has worked in the lives of such incredible people, and then how we can allow God's grace to be transforming us in our lives.
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to close by praying. Dear Lord and loving Heavenly Father, you're far more ready to hear our prayers than we are to pray them. We thank you for the extraordinary measure of your grace that you have showered upon us in Jesus Christ. We thank you for the way it transformed the people we've heard about tonight, John Wesley and Selina, the Countess of Huntingdon. We thank you for their endeavours as flawed human beings, but the way you use them, despite and through them and because of them. And we pray that for some measure of that grace to be in us too. And in Jesus' name we ask, Amen. Thank you all for coming.